Welcome. Happy Monday. Um, my name is Aditya. I'm an analyst here at Echo Northwest. Thank you for joining us for this career lunch and learn info session that we're doing. So at the broad level, what we're looking forward to doing here is talking about Echo, talking about upcoming opportunities, but we also really want this to be a general panel for any of you to ask questions about general career advice in consulting, and get a better sense. Consulting can mean a lot of different things. So to get a better sense of what consulting in this particular space looks like. Um, right at the onset, I do want to say that we do have a very wide range of folk here. We have folks from bachelor's programs. We have folks that are completing their masters. So we're hoping that everybody can take something from this panel. But yeah, we're going to do our best. And then finally, throughout the panel, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. If you have comments that aren't specific questions, there is a separate chat function. And panelists will be answering questions in the Q&A as they come up. But we will have some time at the end for picking questions that that would be cool to hear multiple perspectives from. We might pick them up and have a live conversation about them. So yeah, with that, I think we are ready to go ahead and get started. So yeah, I guess a little bit about Echo before we start. Echo Northwest is the name of our company. We were founded in 1974 by a Professor Ed Whitelaw from the University of Oregon, who was an economics professor there. And our values are independent, insightful, curious, collaboration. So those are, we kind of talk about this in equation form, and we talk about how those first four values of being independent, insightful, curious, and collaborative all sum up, or all go into what we care about the most, which is making positive impact. And so at Echo, we have 5 practice areas. We have the urban systems practice area, a project, and I'm going to highlight like one quick project for each one of these. We're going to get deep dive into projects a little bit more later. But in urban systems, the urban systems practice area recently helped Oregon create its statewide housing plan. For the natural resource practices area, there's a lot of cost benefit analysis. There's like general economic impacts of natural resources. So an example project of that is the natural resources practice area did a cost benefit analysis of the lower Snake River dams, and of what the effects of dam removal of those dams would be. In education and social policy, one of our projects is Disability Benefits 101, which is a website that Echo helps maintain for people with disabilities to, or anybody who's interested, to navigate the different disability laws across different states in the US. We have a business analytics practice area. An example project there was working with the Oregon Tribal Gaming Alliance to quantify the economic impacts of Indian gaming in Oregon. And then finally, the litigation practice area, and one of the first litigation cases that Echo was involved with, which I think is awesome, was helping quantify the damages of the Exxon Valdez oil spill in support of different fishery communities and communities along the bay. So yeah, those are some of our practice areas. Generally today, we're going to have some panelist introductions. We're going to have staff presentations from a bunch of staff. We've got a couple of research analysts, and we have John Toponia, our ex-president of Echo and our senior policy advisor, also joining us. And then we're going to have some structured questions and Q&A from the chats. So again, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and we'll get to them soon. And so with that, I will hand it off to Angelica to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name's Angelica. I am an associate, primarily working in the education and social policy sphere. An associate is kind of similar to a project manager, so in charge of some projects, usually sort of smaller ones or pieces of larger projects. So I've been at Echo for 5 years. I started as a intern and then have been in a variety of roles since then. I have a BA in economics and English from Lewis and Clark College, and I got asked a lot how I would use both of those disciplines. And I can say in my job at Echo, I use both of them basically every single day. My day-to-day work looks like a lot of project management. So this is client coordination, either in the form of like calling clients or emailing them or setting up meetings, etc. Checking budgets and delegating tasks just to make sure that all of our projects stay on track. And then I also am involved in scoping, which is basically designing what a project's going to look like from the start and pitching it to the client, and deliverable production. And I do a lot of report writing. I also do data analysis, so some quantitative roles for me as well, and QA/QC, which is quality assurance and quality control, which is basically just checking over our work and making sure that it meets the client's needs. Some of the favorite types of projects that I work on are categorizing and understanding expenditures and houselessness across the region. That's a pretty big one right now. So basically understanding how are we spending on houselessness, what kinds of programs are we investing in, and how can we use that understanding to create a better system for people experiencing houselessness in the future. I also do a lot of program evaluations for nonprofits, basically looking at a lot of data to see if what the nonprofit is doing is working. Usually these are some sort of educational nonprofit. And then lately, have been enjoying doing a lot of deep dives into public budgets to see if revenue sources are sustainable and equitable. So basically, are the right people paying for the services that they're using? And is whatever government we're looking at, usually local governments, will they be able to sustain themselves in the future based on the revenue mix that they have? And just a fun fact about me, I love being outdoors, as you can see from my pictures. And sometimes I go mushroom hunting. In the top photo, I just found some chanterelles, so I'm very excited about that. And I will pass it on to Taylor. Taylor, you're muted.
My apologies. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so my name's Taylor. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior research analyst at Echo. I work primarily in our urban systems and education and social policy practice areas. And my educational background is in sociology. And so a lot of the work I do here at Echo is focused on developing different kinds of equity-focused tools, looking at like funding and grant programs, evaluating housing, sometimes with like a focus on affordable housing, and other projects that are focused on policy. And so day to day, I'm usually doing some kind of policy or tool research, if that's like common practices, and like literature reviews. And then a lot of times I also help with scheduling interviews, facilitating interviews, and taking notes in interviews. And then, I'll typically do the theme analysis of those notes, and even help with analyzing like written survey responses. And then lastly, I do a lot of helping outline and write reports. And so that's probably one of my favorite things to do. When it comes to favorite projects, I really liked our Washington Legislative Equity Impact Statement project, where we helped the state think through different models of what an equity assessment tool would look like for legislation. And then I also really liked our King County Redlining and Reparations project, where we outlined the history of housing discrimination in King County and thought through different models for reparations. One fun fact about me is that I like to paint in my free time. And so the pictures on the left are a few paintings that I've done in the past few years or so. So yeah, I will pass it to Salma.
Great. Hello. My name is Salma Huck. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a senior research analyst. I've been here just under 3 years now, and I work primarily in the natural resources practice area. I graduated with a degree in economics from Reed here in Portland. And some of my day-to-day tasks include meetings, lots of meetings, meetings to talk about how to move a project forward, meetings to talk about what a client said about our work, meetings just to check in and see what else needs to be done and problem solve. I also do lots of data analysis and cleaning. I like to use R a lot, and Excel as well, depending on what's needed. And then, unlike Taylor, I hate report writing, but I still have to do a lot of it. So in one day, I might do all three of these things for a bunch of different projects. One project that I'm working on a lot, which maybe I consider my favorite, is the Seelamoxie Irrigation District in Yakima County, Washington. So our client is the irrigation district, and we're helping them look at, so in the future, water shortage is going to be a big problem over there. And so we're helping them evaluate which parts of their irrigation district are going to be most affected by water shortages and how that is going to affect their economic situation. So how much revenue they may lose due to lost farm space. And I love garlic. That's my fun fact.
Awesome. Thanks, Selma. Jolie.
Hi, my name is Jolie Brownell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a research analyst at ECHO. I started back in May of last year. And my main practice areas are in the urban systems and social policy, where I also get to use my major, women and gender studies, pretty much every single day, which I love. My day-to-day looks like policy and best practice research. And so that looks like a lot of literature reviews and general research, also equity analysis. And so looking at how, various policies, recommendations, or things that we look at, what the equitable impact that has on various communities, and then mitigating any inequitable impacts. And also report writing. I am a writer at heart, and so I love report writing and the outlining and organization of that. And I also work with interviews and note taking, and also just kind of structuring community engagement at large and what it means to do community engagement in a trauma-informed way. Some of my favorite projects that I've worked on is also the King County redlining and reparations project that I did with Taylor. We're actually going to present on it a little bit later. And then a project that I'm working on right now is the Vancouver Heights Equitable Development Project. And that is, my part in this was a literature review on the best practices around, well, what equitable development means, and also what it means to institute anti-displacement strategies to really make sure that this project that they have coming up will benefit their whole community and not displace anyone. A fun fact about me is I have been writing poetry for almost 10 years. So I'm a poet, and I have a TEDx performance where I share some of my poetry, and it's called Call Me by My Name, Not My Stereotype. And I'll pass it off to Scott.
Hey all, my name is Scott Goodman. I use he, they pronouns. I'm coming to ECHO Northwest as a second career. I started out in education. So I have a master's in education from Portland State University. Did my undergrad at the University of Oregon Honors College with Spanish and philosophy as my majors. And then after education, I was at Portland State University to get my master's in urban and regional planning. And so at ECHO Northwest, I am an associate working primarily in urban systems. So what that means for my day-to-day is when I was in my program at Portland State, I focused in real estate development and affordable housing development. And so I'll look at a lot of the spreadsheets in Excel that will talk about different ways of determining feasibility, whether or not housing can be built in an area based on the costs, estimated land prices that we're trying to determine, what different market rate factors are influencing it. And so that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is analyzing those numbers. Part of that also includes looking at zoning code a lot to find out what types of buildings can fit and what types of buildings can't fit. And one of the major things as well that ECHO Northwest does a lot of work in, I do a lot of work in this, has to do with the Oregon Housing Needs Analyses, which have to do with looking at what are the needs that different jurisdictions have, what's the capacity that they have of buildable land inventory, and what are strategies for producing the needed housing that we need everywhere across our communities. One of the things that goes into that, we'll be talking with developers, so doing interviews with them and saying, hey, what are the barriers that you're running into? What's working well? What's not working well? That's a lot of what my day-to-day looks like. Some of my favorite projects have had to do with, as I was mentioning, real estate feasibility, looking in areas where if someone's considering changing their zoning code to allow more middle housing types, some denser housing, what's that going to do to areas? What's the expected development forecast going forward? So it's very interesting, impactful, fun work that I like a lot. And fun facts about me, I like gardening a lot. And so I've got a fiscally sponsored nonprofit group that goes into right-of-way areas, which is so like not where cars are driving on the street, that is the right-of-way, but we'll go to the side of that, of like abandoned areas that are filled with blackberries or other invasive species. We'll pull out the invasive species and we'll plant native plants and pollinators and make little benchy sorts of things around the neighborhood. So that's what I like to do in my free time. And then I think we're finishing up with Aditya.
Thank you, Scott. So hello, everyone. My name is Aditya. I use he, him pronouns. I am a research analyst in litigation and broadly data analytics at ECHO. I just recently completed my BA in economics from Reed College and have been at ECHO since June last year. I do a lot of quantitative work at ECHO, so a lot of my day-to-day work looks like programming in Python or doing code, in R or GIS. A lot of that work is just preparing data and cleaning data, and sometimes it involves making data visualizations that different project managers or project directors are asking for. And then a lot of my job is also doing research, literature reviews and research in general, and that can look like looking at case studies, looking at academic literature, and compiling what the most relevant pieces of literature for our projects. My favorite project is the BART Transbay Rail Crossing that I will also present on shortly. And my fun fact is that I'm an international student from Pune, India. Now I don't know if that's fun, and I'm not a student, but I put that in there to kind of point to all the international, if there are any international students in the call, to express that ECHO does do OPT, does take on international students on OPT. So hope that's fun for you. Okay, so we're gonna get into a few more detailed presentations on specific projects. As you can tell, ECHO works in policy, but that can mean a lot of different things. And so our first project is by Jolien Taylor.
Awesome. Remember to unmute myself this time. So yeah, Jolie and I are going to be talking about a project that we worked on for Washington's King County Wastewater Treatment Division, in which we looked at the impact of racially discriminatory housing practices on intergenerational wealth loss for BIPOC in King County. You can go to the next slide. So the King County Wastewater Treatment Division is considering a wastewater capacity charge or reduction or exemption for populations who have been impacted by redlining and housing discrimination in the past. To support their work, we needed to demonstrate how racial housing discrimination led to homeownership gaps and then intergenerational wealth loss for BIPOC, and then outline approaches that other cities have taken to provide reparations for historical harms. Next slide, please. So this report weaves together the findings of a literature review, a quantitative analysis, and a qualitative analysis. The quantitative analysis offers a broader understanding of the financial impact of racial homeownership discrimination, while the qualitative historical research, which included interviews with affected community members, sheds important light on how racist real estate practices have deep and profound impacts on communities that go far beyond financial loss. Next slide. The first section of our report outlined in a detailed timeline all of the ways in which local, state, and federal institutions, whether like private or public, intentionally and sometimes unintentionally set up barriers to homeownership for BIPOC in King County. And then we paid special attention to like deliberately racist real estate policies such as racial deed restrictions and redlining. If you go to the next slide, you can see that alongside our historical timeline, we also looked at the differences in homeownership rates between BIPOC and white households in King County from 1950s to 2019. And as you can see, there's a large gap in the homeownership rate between white households in King County, which is that gray bar at the top, and BIPOC households in King County, which is represented by the purple line. And then there's an even larger gap for Black households. So while explicitly racist housing policies were banned in the 1960s, other practices post-1970s, such as single-family zoning, disinvestment, urban renewal, and gentrification, still affected current and prospective BIPOC homeowners. And then, of course, pre-1970s housing discrimination more heavily excluded Black households. And so the impact of these restrictions combined with the post-1970s housing barriers likely had a stronger cumulative effect on Black households than did, other BIPOC, which explains that larger gap we're seeing. And then the next section of our report, moving on from the historical overview, kind of bridged the gap there and looked at more recent barriers to homeownership to show how inequitable access to credit and financial products, mortgage discrimination, disinvestment in BIPOC communities, and gentrification and displacement are all present-day barriers that have contributed to racial homeownership disparities. After that, we dive into our quantitative analysis where we examine the magnitude of intergenerational wealth loss for BIPOC in King County as a result of these racial gaps in homeownership, which were created by housing barriers. So we calculated the lost intergenerational wealth by looking at homeownership gaps, wealth lost to paying rent rather than paying off a mortgage, and wealth lost to differential appreciation rates between homes that are owned by BIPOC and homes that are owned by white people in King County. What we found is that BIPOC have seen an overall intergenerational wealth loss between 12 billion and 34 billion since 1950. And it's likely that the lower end of this range is less realistic, as it assumes that intergenerational wealth loss was not productively invested.
So when we break this down or look at this more specifically for Black households, as Taylor specified before, these racist housing policies had a greater impact. And so we can also see this reflected here. On the lower range of the wealth loss per Black household, we see that there's a range of between 100,000 and 300,000 wealth loss in total versus other POC households, which is a range of 32 to 85,000 total intergenerational wealth loss. And interestingly enough, while we were doing this analysis, the California Reparations Task Force was doing a similar analysis of trying to understand the total wealth loss from for California residents and Black residents. And so we see here that while this number has not been finalized, that for each individual Black resident, they have a total wealth loss of about 200,000, which is interesting because it fits within our own range of our economic analysis. So moving on, the last portion of the report and the section that I worked on mostly was on the opportunities and limitations of reparations. There's a lot of conversations and debates around reparations, but we wanted to kind of use a general framework to organize this section. And so we used transitional justice, the framework of transitional justice, which is a way to repair historic and systemic harms. And reparations is an example of transitional justice. So the examples of these include truth-telling, which can be truth-telling commissions, reparations, direct cash payments, restitution, which is a form of restoring things, especially property, to its original state. And so that often looks like land return. And also institutional reform, and which has to do with, looking at the policies and structural levels and reforming them to create better outcomes. I think one of us, Taylor, I will post this link in the chat if you want to learn more about these examples. So kind of surrounding this larger conversation of reparations is kind of these top, questions of, who gets to qualify for reparations? Is it just, Black people who can prove their descendants from, enslaved Black people, or is it like all Black people? And then also kind of how do we maneuver around the legal barriers to reparations, right? So we have, we have policies now in place that help prevent differential treatment, based on race because of, all these, historic racist policies. However, these kinds of policies like the 14th and 15th Amendment and that, Fair Housing Act now disallow this differential treatment, which makes it harder to pass reparations policies and programs as they do, treat people differentially by race, but as a way to repair such, harm. So that's a complicated thing to look at as well. And then also in this conversation is what about, other people of color, other forms of racism, other forms of discrimination, and, how do we, repair all those other intersectional forms of discrimination? And so while the report, we look at these questions and we don't really come with any big resolutions, we do think it's important to highlight this greater conversation. But I think even though there are these challenges and these big questions, I think it's also really reassuring to know that, reparations have been instituted on a city, state, and federal level. A common key example of this is, individual reparations for survivors of the Japanese internment camps back in 1988. And also, as you probably maybe seen in the news, there's a lot of cities and states trying to pass, and trying to maneuver around these legal limitations and pass various programs for reparations. And so there's a lot that we can learn from these examples and how to institute that for King County. So just some examples of some recent attempts or recent, forms of reparations being passed across the country include, just last year, a 10 million proposal for reparations in Providence, Rhode Island. We have, Abundant Birth Project in California, San Francisco, looking at, inequitable health outcomes. We have the Reparations Task Force, and also in California, which I mentioned, we have the marijuana reparations in Illinois. So there's lots of examples of this happening and lots to learn from. So we included all that in the report as well. And then finally, a really important part of this, right? This is a mixed methods approach for this project. And I think a really important way to highlight this is through the stories that we included. We partnered with Linda Kennedy, who did 11 interviews with folks who in King County and were either living during this time of these racist housing policies or are even, continuing to experience some of these today. And so we have, these 11 stories. And I think it's really important to showcase that, yes, there is a monetary loss, right, from these racist housing policies, but also, there are people who are children and who watch, these racist housing policies prevent their parents from, building equity, ripped apart families, they had to move away. And so understanding the mental, emotional, and intergenerational trauma and the impact of this is also really important to capture with the total wealth loss as well.
So I'll try to keep this last slide brief, but I think we want to talk a little bit about some of the considerations we had to make throughout the project and some bumps we faced as we went through it. So when we were going through the historical section of our research, we had to think about how specific we wanted to be. Do we want to address, every single housing policy that came up? We also needed to like figure out how we could even access some information, like redlining maps, that's not super well documented everywhere. Finding, racial restrictive covenants, that's still a developing area of research in King County. And then, of course, we wanted to make sure that as we were writing the report, we wanted to be really careful about how we were presenting these historical issues, so that there's a clear understanding of how we got where we are today. And then when it came to looking at the financial aspect of homeownership rates and wealth loss, there was simply some issues with data availability when you're looking at, the 1950s up to now. Just the way that they counted homeownership at that time was different than how they do now. And the historical naming conventions for different races and ethnicities was different. And so you'll see that we use BIPOC a lot, which, best practice would be to have more specificity in who exactly you're talking about. But it's kind of difficult to do that when there's not a lot of documentation for each race, and when the groupings and names used to identify each group is like different as the years go on. So there was a little bit of issues we faced with that.
And just to finish up, I think for the reparations, right, for this research, it's a broad research of both like common practices, but also the best practices that have had the, greatest direct impact of repair. And I think in just our general approach, the complexity is like, how do we, weave together all of these various elements, the history, the research, the quantitative data analysis, and these personal experiences in a way that not only gives us a greater understanding of the impact, but also kind of, understands the impact of all of these things at the same time. So yeah, it was a really cool and fun project and complex, but this is just an example of one of the projects we do at ECHO in a mixed methods approach.
Awesome. Thank you, Jolie and Taylor. That was awesome. I'm going to present briefly on the project I was talking about earlier, which is the BART Trans-Bay Rail Crossing. So this project is still ongoing, and the overview is that ECHO is working in collaboration with a team of different firms to develop a land use model to support travel modeling of new rail crossings in the Bay Area. So there are a lot of words there, but at its base, what it is that the Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART, is considering extension to their network, and they are trying to figure out what extensions make most sense. And so the way you do this is by creating what is called a travel model. So travel models are a virtual replication of land use patterns, of travel networks, of location choices, of jobs, and of households. In some sense, it's like creating a simulated city, and using that model to understand the patterns of where people are traveling to and from, and thus where there's going to be demand for travel infrastructure in general, but public transit in specific in this case. So ECHO Northwest's role is to provide insight specifically into the differences in land supply and demand. So this is both impacts on rents, and therefore through rents, impact on development that arise from different public transit expansions. And so the key part of this project that I really want to focus on is what a day in the life of a quantitative analyst, such as myself, looks like in a project like this. And so I spend a lot of time exploring data and preparing it. I have to create pretty robust functions that take on a set of inputs and work on it in ways that the outputs are consistent with this much larger model pipeline that we have, and to understand and use packages. And so at ECHO, we use a lot of different software. It's not that we only use Excel or we only use R. For this project, I've worked a lot in R, in Tidyverse. I've done spatial analysis using GeoPandas. All of my model code is written in Python using Pandas, which is a Python package for data wrangling and data cleaning. I've done same spatial analysis in QGIS. So there are a lot of skills at play here. But what an actual assignment looks like is, so for example, for those of you who are aware, PyPy is basically a package, a library of packages for Python programming. And one of my tasks was, one of my supervisors said, hey, we need to use XYZ package to build out this part of the model. Can you go implement it, or can you go, basically read up on it and use it to create this very particular functionality we need for the model? And so it was a lot of basically like self-driven work in reading through the documentation of that package. And the documentation wasn't great, as it is with many packages. And so actually going into the code base of the package to figure out what we need, what we can use, and incorporating all of that into our actual model pipeline. And then there's a lot of exploring input data to inform modeling decisions. So that input data is, again, because we're working with such a large team of firms, they send us different input data, and a lot of my work is kind of just exploring the data, seeing what the trends are, seeing what measures that we have been given might be useful in creating our land use, our land demand and land supply model. So we have, I won't get into the specifications of the models. Cool. And so with that, I'd like to introduce John. John's going to speak briefly. John is a senior policy advisor here at ECHO, has a master's in public policy from Harvard, has a BA in journalism from University of Oregon. John was the president at ECHO Northwest since 2009 to 2021, and has been at ECHO since 1997, I believe, but has 31 years of cumulative experience in educational, social, and fiscal policy. So we thought it would be interesting to hear, John's take on this whole world of policy consulting.
There you go. Well, hey, thank you. Just sort of thinking back to the company's values and the sort of the founder's original motivation for starting this firm. He was my professor at the University of Oregon, Ed Whitelaw. And his original idea was he was sitting there in academia, and he was looking at public policy and just not seeing as many connections out of academic studies finding their way into day-to-day sort of public policy decisions. And so he talked to sort of his university colleagues and the dean of the school, et cetera, and found this time to be able to come and carve out this role for himself originally, to advise governors and mayors and others, and then ultimately build this firm that is almost now 50 years old and is working up and down the West Coast and across all these various topics. I will say, sort of getting back to the values outlined in the very beginning, and give an illustration of one in particular, insight and impact. And so, impact is we're involved in a project and we would like to know after the fact that something different has happened because of it. And just one example of a project that wasn't really all that technically involved at all. I mean, you've seen some very sophisticated ones just described that are wonderful, but one that we have simple ones as well. And a colleague and I were working with the Oregon Business Council, a collaboration of business leaders who are trying to affect public policy in the state. And they were looking for ways to sort of productively address poverty and improve educational outcomes for kids who are struggling in school. And a colleague and I came across a study, Melissa Rowe is her name. We came across a study in the academic literature by Richard Murnane at Harvard and Greg Duncan at the University of California, Irvine, that basically said they had, if they had to put all their bets on a couple public policy interventions, one would be universal pre-kindergarten. That's an awfully big exercise, and Multnomah County and other places across the country are making progress there. But then they had this other one that was, it was kind of tight and interesting, and it was to expand the earned income tax credit even higher for families with kids who had not been in school yet, so 5 years or younger. And that earned income tax credit is a a federal program, and states piggyback on it to give extra money for families that have earned income. It sort of gives them a raise at the end of the year during tax season. So we came across this proposal. We're working with the business community. We go down to the legislature and we talk with a state representative, Alyssa Kenny Geyer, and she just immediately saw the value in this and started to advocate for it. And it took, I don't know, a couple, 3 weeks, but she got a bill. Ultimately, the bill passed and was signed by the governor. And Oregon ended up with this extra amount of money in its earned income tax credit that goes to families with kids between the ages of 0 and 5. To this day, I believe, I didn't go check right before this meeting, but I've checked in the last 6 months. Oregon is still the only state in the country with that particular policy feature associated with its state earned income tax credit. So it is the kind of thing when you get into sort of public policy consulting and you know, have a really interested, coherent partner on the other side, like our client and the business community and our state representative who we're working with. You know, you can have impact and affect the lives of thousands of people thereafter. So that's just one example. There are many examples over the course of the last 50 years, but one that I often think back to as a moment that sort of keeps me getting up in the morning thinking about how do I do that again. So I'll pass it back.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. So yeah, I think at this stage, we're going to start answering questions. I see some questions that are already being answered in the chat, but we're going to have a live discussion of some of the questions. So yeah, I guess just to get the ball rolling, how is, and this is for all the panelists, how is consulting different from other job experiences or internships you've had? Yeah, whoever feels moved to speak, please go ahead.
Well, I'll jump in on that one. It's fast paced and you've got a lot of variety. And so if there's any particular project that you're not excited about, you can always be grateful that it'll be over in about 6 months. But unlike, you know, working maybe in government or in business where you might have a focus on a particular project for a very long time, here we're sort of working on probably 4, 5, 6 things at a time, and they're in constant motion.
So I think that goes we have sorry, do others have anything to add? I should ask that first. Angelica?
Oh, go ahead, Angelica.
Oh, I don't know if I particularly have anything to add. My main career has been at Echo, but I do think that just having the client dynamic does add something. I mean, so anything that you're doing can be outward facing, and you need to make sure that you're packaging it in a way that is understandable. And you have to have that, you know, that communication aspect as well. So for a lot of jobs where you might be working more in the public sector or something, you're not going to have that kind of interaction with clients. So I think that does add definitely a communication aspect to it that some other similar jobs where you're doing similar roles just won't have that.
And then I was just gonna say, I mean, my previous experience has been as a research assistant in college. And I guess the main difference from that going to here, where I've been for the past few years, is that in my previous job, it was kind of like, yeah, one project I'm working on and the tasks are assigned to me, you know, as my boss wanted me to do them. Whereas here, there's a lot of different things you can do. I feel like there's been, at least when we have a lot of work coming in, I can almost kind of like choose where I want to dip my toes into. There are times obviously where you have to take on work that like maybe you're not as interested in, but for the most part, like we're doing so many different interesting things. And there's a lot of choice there. And then the other thing is there's a little bit of a more responsibility on my part to be like telling people, hey, I have this much capacity. Do you have work that I can do for the next, couple of months or something? So there's a lot, there's more responsibility on my part as a research analyst to have a lot of good like time management, and really tracking like what my workload is over the next few weeks or months or whatever. Whereas in previous roles, it's kind of like you're relying on your boss to tell you what to do and when to do it.
Mhm. So on the tail end of that, I think that there have been a couple of questions in the chat about choosing to work in consulting over working for a city or for a regional government. Do any of you have thoughts on, that dynamic and why? Yeah, Jolie.
I do. I'm beginning my career at Echo. The only thing I did before this was a research intern for Beaverton, City of Beaverton. But I've always found consulting to be really interesting. My dad did consulting, and I think the positionality of consultants, I think is really cool. And that, we get to work with a whole bunch of different people, organizations, the city, and bring an outside perspective while also digging into, their practices, their policies, and their work. And so we kind of get a both insider and outsider perspective. And so that can, so in that, with that position, we can, get to know what their work is and help them, but also bringing out outside perspective, or, amplifying certain perspectives even within their own work or their community that, doesn't always get as amplified. And so with our kind of economic consultant, professionality and privilege with that, we get to use that to amplify other communities and other work as well. So I really like that about the consulting world.
Yeah, I would say the variety and the reach that you can have as a consultant is something that I really personally value and don't really feel like you're going to get in, maybe jobs that seem sort of similar in the public sector, but I think it's really valuable in consulting that you are working with all these different people and across all of these different projects that you wouldn't have an opportunity to do in any other job.
Any other thoughts? Okay, so what courses would you recommend, broadening this out to consulting at large? Like, what courses would you recommend any of our students here to be taking in preparation for a career like this?
I can go.
Mhm.
I would recommend, so as you've heard throughout our introductions, some of us do stuff more related to data work, some of us do more stuff related to like research, lit reviews, report writing, talking to folks, stakeholders. So you don't have to do both. You don't have to do, like, it's totally fine if you are like, oh, I'm really into data, that's fine. Or I really don't care about numbers and I care about the people-to-people aspect. I think that either of those are fine, but I think it's helpful to have writing experience because report writing and writing up results is like the integral part of being a consultant because you're conveying information to your clients and the public. And I think it is helpful to have some sort of topical background. So it's policy consulting, but with an economics focus. So we care about understanding, costs and benefits and supply and demand. And so I think it's helpful to have some sort of background in economics or housing or whatever field you're interested in within the consulting world. One class I took that I really liked was a history class called Water in the American West. I think it's actually the most helpful class I took in college in retrospect, not any of the statistics or economics or whatever classes, because that class really focused in on the history of water policy and water rights. And that's something that I've ended up working on a lot with ECHO. So.
I also want to kind of piggyback and amplify what Salma was saying. I obviously took the no thank you, I don't do numbers route. But I'm getting into a little bit with it with like methodology and stuff. So you'll definitely be, intermixed with both worlds. But I also think just taking classes, like Salma was saying, that just help you understand the world better, whether, whatever topical wise, I think is really important because, even in our quantitative work and the data and the numbers, you know, it's our job to interpret that and like, okay, here's a whole sheet of papers and like with numbers, but what does that mean, right? What does that impact have for, you know, our client and their community and who they're serving? And so being able to understand, you know, aspects of the world, aspects of how society works is really important to help in that interpretation, and that historical analysis and like trends and what that means for today. So as a, you know, women and gender studies student, I'm totally going to pitch to take, you know, these outside, you know, sociology, women and gender studies, you know, African American studies, like these kind of classes that are not very economic or, you know, data heavy, even though I think they'll really help you just to understand our context in our world. That will help in understanding, you know, all the numbers and fill in the reports and like, what does this work actually mean?
And just to stay on the more quantitative side, I think some of my most helpful classes were statistics, like anything around statistics is really helpful to understand data, and you get sort of practice working with data. And so there's really large data sets, reading data dictionaries, that kind of stuff. And even if you aren't going to be working with data every single day, just having that baseline understanding can be really helpful when you're working across lots of different people across the firm.
Yeah, I'll add to that on the quantitative side, I don't think at Echo anyway, there is no one program of preference that we have that, oh, you have to work in state or you have to work in R. And so it's more that you build your skills in a program that is pretty robust. And I think the types of data we use, there's a lot of demographic data, there's a lot of spatial data, there's all kinds of data that we end up having to work with. Sometimes it's just public records where it's horribly messy and you have to just spend hours cleaning it up. But I think my classes in general statistics, but ones that were more concentrated on building skills in some of the specific packages in R or specific packages in spatial data were really helpful for me. Scott, yeah.
Yeah. Regarding classes that were helpful, courses I would recommend. So in the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program, the courses that really helped me out doing what I'm doing right now were the real estate development and affordable housing finance courses that in my program, those were sort of additional classes that weren't required, but I wish that they were required for more people to take, because the basic understanding of like how we value land is extremely applicable to all sorts of other areas of the work that we're doing. And just having a couple courses that made me more comfortable and familiar with that language, because it is a slightly different language to learn, I found extremely helpful. I wish they were required courses for anyone going into planning work.
Awesome. Is there, I think we can move to the next question. So, there have been questions around kind of the different positions at Echo. So a question is, what does Echo look for in a prospective member of their team? And then on the same vein, if people want to talk to a little bit about the differences between RAs and associates, and what the qualifications and important skill sets and personalities there are.
Did you say this is for RAs or?
Yeah, RAs, associates. I guess we can start with what is the difference between RAs and associates, who gets hired in which positions, and what does that look like?
Angelica, do you want to talk about the difference between RAs and associates, given you've gotten promotion?
Yeah, I will say that there are not a lot of hard and fast rules here, at least that I've seen, and there are overlap between positions. But I think the main difference between like an RA and an associate is, as an associate, you're more likely to actually be like managing a project. Like you're in charge of this project. You're the one who's emailing and calling the client. You're the one who's checking in with team members to make sure that they're all getting their pieces in on time. But if you're an RA, you're going to be more likely like focused on either a quantitative or qualitative piece of the project that might be like your main piece, like maybe you're doing a survey or developing a survey, or you're doing all the like demographics and producing all of the charts and graphics for that. But you're not usually going to be like interfacing with the client or like scheduling meetings or doing that more sort of management component. And then you're usually not responsible for like pulling together the whole like final deliverable and kind of putting the bow on it. And sometimes as an associate, you will be sort of the person who's pulling everything together and making sure we've got all the pieces in the story right. And I think that's the biggest difference.
I think traditionally for RAs are often hired out of undergrad. Associates are often hired out of grad school. But I think industry experience plays a very big role in this. So Angelica, for example, has been at Echo for 6 years, 7 years now, and started off
5 or 6.
5 or 6, but has gone from an RA to the associate level. And there are associates who are kind of on track or have gone on to become PMs, or that is project managers, with a master's as they progress in their career. But I think in terms of skill sets, and this is going to be very specific to the specific job, but at Echo, I think those values, we do really care about them. I think, as you might have heard, like there's a lot of different moving parts to a lot of our projects. So a little bit of ability to work outside your comfort zones and to communicate clearly things that are working well and things that you need help with, and working in that team setting, I think is something that is really necessary in this consulting background.
Yeah, I think if I could think of 2 words that are really important for any Echoite, it's that you're both curious and you're willing to persevere. So being curious about exploring things, even if it's like maybe outside of the purview of your normal work, and then also just persevering through times when it can be kind of tough or when you're on a steep learning curve. And then the other thing, like Aditya mentioned, just being a really good and clear communicator and being willing to reach out and ask for help when you are too deep, are all really great things to have.
Okay, I have my eye on the time and we are at time. So I do want to add, just as we come to a close, that I've seen the questions about hiring openings and timelines in the chat. We will be following up with an email with information about our positions and timelines. We are hiring for both associate and RA levels. And at the associate level, we're definitely looking at the urban systems practice areas hiring, the natural resources practice areas hiring. So there are a lot of exciting positions coming up. A good way to keep track of them yourselves is going and following Echo's LinkedIn page. But you will also receive all of those communications through the email, and we'll include a recording of this webinar if you want to go back and listen to a particular question or something like that. And I had one other thought before we concluded, but it is completely gone from me.
Well, we'll answer the questions. We'll send a whole list of answers to all the questions as well.
Awesome. And yeah, if you have questions about any of the specific practice areas, I think most of our panelists are happy to field questions on LinkedIn, or you can connect with them on LinkedIn. And yeah, hope this was a helpful conversation. Hope this was a helpful lunch and learn for all of you. And thank you so much for joining.